Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. My name is Susan Park. I'm a professor of global governance in the discipline of government and international relations in FAS.
Thanks, Susan. And Kate.
Hi all, Kate Owens. I'm an associate professor at Sydney Law School. I specialise in environmental law. Good to
Thanks.
be here.
It's wonderful to have you both. As I asked our previous presenter, why is this topic area, this work that you do, important to you? Start with you, Susan.
Thank you. Look, we just find it so important. Kate and I have been working on climate finance for a while now, and one of the critical sort of aims of climate finance is to get funding to people that actually need it in terms of adaptation and mitigation. And it's just not getting to the Pacific. So this is why we're doing the work that we're doing to figure out better ways.
Awesome. Thanks, Susan. And Kate?
Yeah, well said, Susan. I mean, certainly working at Sydney Law School, in this region, which is deeply connected to the Pacific, we're just interested in how, international climate systems can work as they're supposed to work. They're designed to support vulnerable countries. So why isn't this happening?
Yeah, completely agree. Well, please join me in welcoming Susan and Kate for their presentation.
Thank you. Look, it's such a pleasure to be here, and we're really, really grateful, Georgie, that you've helped to create this learning and sharing space. And we feel really privileged to be part of it. So as Kate's driving the PowerPoint, so we'll see how we haven't practiced this, so we'll see how we go together. But we really wanted to investigate what we see as a focus for Pacific Island countries. This idea that there needs to be a simplified access to international climate finance. So essentially, this is a draft paper that we have written with other colleagues as well. And yes, thank you. So this is with George Carter from the ANU, Ellen Rees and Ricky Scanlon, who were our research assistants and are now our co-authors. So the draft paper is Pacific Diplomacy to Institutional Design, defining simplified access to climate finance. And essentially what the paper in this presentation seeks to do is to look at how this idea of simplified access sort of entered the Pacific discourse in climate diplomacy. Like, what is it that Pacific Islander countries were asking for in terms of the amount of finance that was being directed towards principally mitigation and adaptation in terms of climate finance. And so what we wanted to do was to identify how this idea sort of was taken up by Pacific Island countries when they were negotiating in climate diplomacy to try and find better ways to be able to access climate finance in order to be able to adapt to climate change. So we really wanted to look at key documents from the Pacific Islands Forum discussions and related regional policy processes. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Kate.
Thanks, Susan. So as all of you in the Zoom room will no doubt know, Pacific communities are already on the front line of climate change. There's coastal erosion, facing stronger and more frequent cyclones, among the many other impacts. Regional organisations like SREP and the Pacific Islands Forum have been documenting these kinds of impacts for years. And I'd like you to imagine that you're a government official in one of these countries. Your community needs support to respond to these risks. You know that there is funding available to help you respond. And in fact, the international community repeatedly says that Pacific countries are a priority for climate finance. But then you discover that to access this funding, you need a 150-page proposal, you need complex financial compliance systems in place, multiple international partners, and months or sometimes years of technical prep. And your ministry has potentially 5 to 6 staff working across everything, so climate, environment, disaster response, international reporting. And at the same time, your country is preparing for the next climate, the next cyclone season. So this is very close to the scenario that many Pacific governments describe when they talk about trying to access global climate finance. It's an issue that comes up repeatedly in discussions with the Pacific Island Forum and within regional climate negotiations. And international finance systems repeatedly say that Pacific countries are a priority. But when Pacific governments actually try to access these funds, the process then becomes extraordinarily difficult. Pacific countries contribute almost nothing to global emissions, but they are among the most exposed to these climate impacts. So the puzzle that Susan and I and our collaborators started to think about was quite simple. If the money exists, then why is it so hard to access? So across Pacific Island Forum communiques, regional declarations, climate negotiations, one request appears again and again, and that is for simplified access. So the message is basically that, we don't just need more climate finance, we need climate finance systems that are simpler, that are more usable for small and capacity constrained states. And the interesting thing, I think, is that although this phrase appears, relatively frequently in Pacific diplomacy, it's really defined in specific terms. So what exactly needs to be simplified? Is it the paperwork? Is it the approval timelines? Is it funding structures? Or is it something deeper? So our research does try to unpack this. And there's a couple of different ways of seeing the problem. So the first approach is what international institutions, so institutions like the Green Climate Fund, often call enhanced access. So this approach basically says, well, the system's mostly fine, we just need to make it work a little bit better. So their reforms or their diagnoses sort of focus on things like streamlining application procedures, providing technical assistance, so-called readiness support, improving approval processes. So in other words, on this view of the world, the system just needs a bit of refinement. But Pacific leaders are often expressing something a little different, and their message is closer to, the system itself might not have been designed with small states in mind. So instead of just improving the system, we might need to revisit and rethink the fundamentals. So to explore this, we didn't just study climate finance, we actually looked at how global funding works in other sectors, particularly health and education. These sectors face quite a similar challenge in that they need to distribute quite large volumes of funding across countries that have quite different levels of capacity. So some countries have huge ministries, they have technical agencies, others have very small administrations. So the question becomes, how do these sectors design funding systems that are usable across quite different contexts? And from this comparison, we found that whether funding systems are accessible really depends on a set of design choices, and 6 choices stood out to us. So the first is, who is the funding designed for? So if vulnerable countries have to compete directly with larger countries, then they often lose out. Secondly, who's allowed to apply? So some climate funds require institutions to meet really quite demanding accreditation standards before they can even participate. So for small governments, those standards are extremely hard to meet. Third, the size of projects. So many climate finance projects are huge, hundreds, tens of millions of dollars. But that scale often requires administrative systems that small states simply don't have. Fourth, who actually makes the decisions? So do decisions happen locally, or do they sit with international agencies? 5, who gets to participate in shaping priorities? So are communities involved, or are projects designed externally? And number 6, how does learning happen? So do funding systems help countries share experiences and from this build capacity over time? So together these features shape whether funding systems actually become accessible in practice. Over to you, Susan.
Kate. So, what our comparison revealed when looking at climate finance versus education and health in the Pacific was that many of the climate finance systems unintentionally favoured these large actors. So, they look for large projects that could be disseminated by large intermediaries. So, this is the multilateral development banks like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or UNDP, because precisely the projects were themselves large, complex, and administratively demanding. So this is a way for the climate finance institutions to be able to say, we've allocated X amount of dollars for the Pacific for these 3, 4, or 5 big projects. The result is that international organisations, not Pacific Island countries, are controlling the actual design of the project and the delivery. So access is really controlled through these quite demanding accreditation systems that many small island countries just can't meet. And even when projects take place in Pacific countries, much of the design and control is not really housed in government itself. At the same time, we note that Pacific institutions like the Micronesia Conservation Trust show that smaller and locally grounded financing facilities actually can work effectively. So we're not saying that nothing is out there as an alternative. There are alternatives. But in sectors like global health funding, it's often allocated much more predictably. So we can consider, onto the next page, please, Kate, that questions of scale really come into it. Climate funding often sits at 2 very large extremes, either very, very small community grant projects or these large multi-million-dollar projects. And climate finance evidence suggests that many Pacific institutions actually operate not at those extremes, that mid-scale grants between $100,000 and $400,000 would actually be the sort of sweet spot for being able to undertake climate mitigation projects in Pacific Island countries. Next slide, please, Kate. So large enough to achieve meaningful change, but small enough to be able to manage effectively. And we do note that there are some Pacific initiatives, including the Pacific Resilience Facility, that are beginning to explore this type of approach. So what does simplified access really mean for the Pacific? It means systems that have predictable funding opportunities, which means governments can actually plan ahead as to how they want to use the funding that is available to them. It means eligibility rules that protect access for small and vulnerable states, actually giving the states themselves the opportunity to be able to direct their own climate adaptation. And it means designing procedures that match the capacity of Pacific Island countries. I think everyone's fully aware of the overburden that comes with any working with any intergovernmental agency and the reporting requirements that are expected and quite often duplicated. It also means reducing reliance on intermediaries, less focus on financing being distributed by UNDP or by the World Bank or ADB. So in providing much more local decision-making capability, this means that there is better planning and better coherence in climate adaptation at the local level. And it also means providing for some learning and capacity building within the states themselves. Next slide. So this is all important because we know that access can design, the design of access to climate adaptation finance determines who is actually implementing the adaptation, whose knowledge shapes solutions, and how quickly communities can respond to climate risk. Last slide, please, Kate. And so our final takeaway is that access to climate finance directly affects Pacific resilience, and if systems are designed mainly around the administrative capacities of large institutions, then those actors themselves will dominate access. If systems are actually designed around the realities of small island states and local institutions, then they can actually lead with adaptation in their own context. And when Pacific leaders call for simplified access, they're actually asking for financing systems that match the realities that they face. So we see this as not just a technical question, but around whether or not global climate finance can actually work for the places that need it most. And that's us. Thank you.
Round of applause. Thank you so much, Susan and Kate. That was wonderful. Ah, this is why I love these presentations because it's got me thinking all over the place in regards to the practicalities, but also the different concepts and the ways in which those things play out, globally, regionally, locally. It just, I've got all these things, but I'm going to hand it over to the rest of to the Zoom room if there's questions or comments that people would like to share. Thank you. Professor Tracy Marfilio from Avondale
Yes,
University. Thank you, Tracy.
thank you, Professor Ravulo, and to the University of Sydney for opening this up to those of us outside of your university to take part. So really pleased to be being able to jump in today. Thank you for that very interesting and important research and presentation. I've done some research in the Pacific on Pacific climate mobility in 6 countries, working at the kind of family, very ground level. And one of the things that we heard is that when there is climate finance for a country, it doesn't necessarily move out of the main centre to really reach the rural and outer island areas. But also I noticed that your study focused on institutions being Pacific states, and a lot of service provision action is led by NGOs, maybe including churches, and even private sector. So funding that's available not only for states, but for other sectors to also access, including universities in the Pacific, to actually lead some of this work instead of universities from outside of the Pacific when it comes to research and evaluation, consultancy, etc. So just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Kate, do you want to take a first shot, or I'm happy to go?
Look, it's an excellent point, Tracy. Yeah, thank you. We have noticed this pattern ourselves, particularly I've just been in Vanuatu, and they were saying, out to Pele Island there, sort of off the main island, and they were saying, well, we don't really see the government, we take care of our own affairs, and the school's recently been done up by Save the Children. So, NGOs, large international NGOs do seem to be very well established in this space. Some of them do have accreditation under some of the big climate funds, but there's still a bit of a gap, and that's where we're hoping, that we can create space and criteria that will work for, local NGOs. I'm thinking of organizations like Live and Learn, where, if the eligibility criteria were relaxed a little bit, then they could have direct access into these pools and be given authority to, manage. I mean, if it's not hundreds of thousands, then tens of thousands, and perform that, that more locally led role in that space. So that's certainly a big part of what simplified access should mean in this space. And yep, just wholly agree with your comment. Thank you, Tracy.
Yeah, thanks. I'd just like to add on to Kate's comments, which is that where our working hypotheses, I guess, is that if Pacific Island countries themselves could be the intermediaries rather than UNDP or World Bank, with the right style of funding and reporting requirements, that this would make it easier to unlock funding for NGOs that are undertaking the actual projects or the private sector or other actors. That's kind of where we're sitting, is that if it's easier for the government to be able to distribute, then it might be easier to actually get it to those working partners.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Susan. Tracy, I need to put another comment in here. I think even international NGOs have quasi-local presence faces, but they are actually controlled from overseas, not locally controlled. Yes, yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting, that's some of the thoughts that I had when you were presenting is Exactly. I loved how you asked us to position ourselves in the everyday reality of this is what's happening, and they've got to do all this, you know, bureaucratic stuff, yet the impacts continue to happen every single day. Like it's just, yeah, how do we make that make sense in regards to the realities of then mitigation, let alone responding in a proactive way? Yeah. Other comments or questions that people would like to ask or raise? John, Professor John Connell. Yeah, you're on mute, John. Sorry.
Is that better?
Yep.
Yes, you're on
Oh,
now. Thank you.
okay. Okay, it's an old story, isn't it? We've talked about these kind of issues for so long; they just reverberate and recur without really significant changes. Why is that so? Because ultimately, I think we're talking about small countries and small governments. So I remember in Tonga ages ago, Apeli Howe office saying we have this fabulous central planning office. They're really good. We've got some great people. Some of them are trained overseas, some locally, and they really know what they're doing. The trouble is, there's only 5 of them in this particular office, which means that one is on leave, one is at a workshop overseas, one is sick, one is out in the provinces taking some NGO operation on World Bank official around. So we only have one person in the office. That person can't do the job because they need to consult with the others and they're unwilling to take the decision by themselves. So the consequence of that is pretty well all these kind of reports about how we should develop local strategies, etc., always finishes up by saying capacity building, capacity building. And yet what exactly that capacity is and how it can be maintained and shared and developed over time is really thought about. The other difficulty is not just that there are small numbers of people and small numbers of people really qualified to talk about some of these kinds of issues effectively, is that they change as well. The government recognises that there's one really good guy in central planning. Well, that's a waste of time. We don't want that person in central planning. Shift them into the Ministry of Finance, something important. So the institutional knowledge changes and disappears as well. And that goes. So again, when people tend to conclude about some kinds of projects along these lines, it's always about how can they be better managed? How can they be better integrated? They are, after all, likely to be multidisciplinary, and that constitutes a problem when you're trying to bring shared or you're trying to bring different ministries together to think about issues like infrastructure, water provision, dealing with hazards, etc., etc., etc. I won't go on. I could go on forever. I won't.
Any thanks, John. Comments from Susan and Kate. And I just love the shout out to the Tales of the Tikongs
Yeah.
book from Epeli Hawafa, one of my
And kisses at the
favorite.
nether ends as well.
Oh, Kisses in the Netherlands as well. That's right. Love exactly the satire that Apelli talks about in regards to the notion of development. He's like D dot E dot, and the way in which things are ran even regionally. Thanks, John. Comments from Susan and Kate?
Okay, do you want to start? Or I'm happy to.
Oh, look, I agree. I mean, I agree with everything you've said, John. I suppose it underlines the point that Tracy was making as well, that when we're talking about local capacity, local leadership, we can't just confine this to the state. It is the case that a lot of local NGOs are actually conducting and governing these projects, particularly smaller community-based adaptation projects. And we need to sort of think about building capacity across the entire system of actors in the state, including the universities as well. So yeah, just that's about all I'd have to add to that at that stage.
Yeah, thanks. And it's such a really important point. I think one of the reasons why we were attracted to sort of grappling with the rules that global institutions have is that they're not designed for Pacific Island countries. They're designed for really well-funded very well established institutions, bureaucracies in developed countries. And it always sort of surprises me that, you know, there is this expectation that a very small team in a Pacific Island country will be able to do all the anti-money laundering checklists, that they'll be able to do all of the other checklists that are required in order to get a very small amount of money at the end of the day. And yet, you know, it takes just so long. So the big focus on simplified access is to be able to grapple with the reality of having a very small number of people working on this who are overstretched, as you pointed out. And one of the things that I think our has really informed our research is I've forgotten her first name, McNamara's work, who points out that a lot.
Karen McNamara.
Karen, yes, thank you. Her research shows that more successful climate adaptation occurs where local communities actually have a stake in the project, and to be able to have that vertical integration of being able to finance the sweet spot of the amount of financing going to the people that it needs to get to in order to be able to have any sort of chance at success. So if you have that sort of vertical integration where not everyone's doing everything, but enough people are in the right places, then hopefully something can happen.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, Susan and Kate. And another round of applause for your wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Manaaka whakalevu, for that.